Hi, this video is to help readers with getting into part 7 of the theory of moral sentiments. It's the final part, and it had always been there in the book work. The new part to the final edition of the theory of moral sentiments, the new part was part 6. Part 7, however, was expanded somewhat in the final edition. And basically, he goes into part 7 as though he's saying, okay, now you've read my take on moral sentiments. How does it relate to other systems that have gained renown or influence in the world, for all human ages? And so he's relating, as it were, this part, all this in the book to now other systems here in the final part 7. How does mine relate to the previous? What he says in the first paragraph is helpful and striking. He says that in all the previous systems, we find elements of my system, and in that respect, they're sound, where they have recognized those principles or elements. But since they've neglected other ones, they've been often one-sided, as they are all of them in this respect founded upon natural principles. They are all of them in some measure in the right. But as many of them are derived from a partial and imperfect view of nature, there are many of them too, in some respects, in the wrong. So what he's suggesting here is that different systems have highlighted and emphasized different elements or principles, and I've got them all covered. And you can see in my system those particular principles which other people have focused on, something to that effect. So it's a rather grandiose paragraph in a way. It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it was meant somewhat ironically or what, but that's an interesting opening to the part. And so in the next paragraph, he sets out the two questions that will form the two sections of the part. He says there are two questions to be considered in treating the principles of morals. First, wherein does virtue consist? Or what is the tone of temper and tenor of conduct which constitutes the excellent and praiseworthy character, the character which is the natural object of esteem, honor, and approbation? So he's saying, what makes certain kinds of conduct and character virtuous? What, as it were, is the essence of virtue? Is there some sort of synonym we could use to kind of get at the core or the essence of virtue? That's basically, what does virtue consist in, is basically the first question. By the way, anyone watching this video, I encourage you to speed it up because I know I speak slowly. So that's the first. And then the second, by what power or faculty in the mind is it that this character, whatever it be, is recommended to us? Or in other words, how and by what means does it come to pass that the mind prefers one tenor of conduct to another, denominates one right and the other wrong, considers one as the object of approbation, honor, and reward, and the other of blame, censure, and punishment? So this question is, by what process in the mind, what faculty do we apprehend virtue or virtuousness? I guess the way he puts it, you should also say, not only by what process do we perceive it or apprehend it, but what leads us to embrace it. Okay, because you could think of people like demonish people recognizing it but not embracing it, I suppose. And he seems to be kind of collapsing those together here. So these are the two big questions, okay? And he's setting this out here in this short section 1. And then the first question is taken up in the next section, section 2. And the other question is taken up in the following section, section 3. And then there's a fourth section, which I'm not going to talk about today. So just to say a little bit about the next section, where he considers what virtue consists in, he considers 3 main things, and each of these are a chapter. The first is that, well, before I say, let me just point out that one thing you certainly should ask yourself with these 2 questions in mind is, okay, so where does Smith see his system fitting in? Like, where does he say, what does he say virtue consists in? And what does he say is the principle or faculty of perceiving and embracing virtue? So those are good questions. And I think they're somewhat answered in what he says. He's not very direct and explicit about it. But I do think actually the answer is perhaps in a way kind of complicated, which is one of the interesting things to think about in reading these parts of section 7. So in terms of what virtue consists in, what, as it were, is kind of a synonym of virtuousness. He considers first propriety, that is, of the systems which make virtue consist in propriety. And this is very long. This is a chapter that he expanded considerably in the final edition of the work. And he very notably starts off treating with Plato here, and gives this very rich discussion of Plato, and it leads into the justices paragraph, which is extremely important. It's where he distinguishes 3 kinds of justice: commutative, distributive, and estimative. And he says that when he goes through this, it's a little bit funny. He says Plato's account, it is evident, coincides in every respect with what we have said above concerning the propriety of conduct. So that sounds like a very strong, embrace or identification with Plato and with, his propriety take on where virtue consists in. And I think that's right. He then goes into Aristotle and he says, this too fits mine. Here with Aristotle, he talks principally about vice, virtue, vice, or 3V framing. And then about habit, and that virtue is a matter of a mode of conduct, a habitual, it's not just a one-off thing. And then he goes into the Stoics at great length, actually. Talks quite a bit about suicide here. And that goes on, and then he comes finally to just a short paragraph about moderns on this notion that virtue consists in propriety. And here he mentions Clark, Wollaston, Shaftesbury. And so you definitely get a sense that he is putting his system quite a lot under this propriety thing. He's saying my propriety is like what Plato said about propriety, in effect. Now, something to keep in mind there is that propriety is that fair to middling, above which is praiseworthy and below which is blameworthy. And that is not the scheme or logic of commutative justice, which is grammar-like, precise and accurate. And there is no praise for doing commutative justice. If you succeed the whole day of not messing with other people's stuff, you don't get any praise or applause. And he doesn't there's a sort of, you could kind of associate it with propriety, but he tends to make propriety more about the loose, vague, and indeterminate, as opposed to the precise and accurate virtues. And, commutative justice is the only precise and accurate virtue. And in that way, it's like grammar. When outside of grammar school, beyond grammar school, you don't get any praise for getting your grammar right. So in that sense, because he gives such emphasis to commutative justice, you might say that he's not just this propriety. So maybe he's not just that, but he doesn't spell this out clearly at all. So anyway, the second is prudence, which is to say that virtue consists in prudence. And here he talks especially about Epicurus. And he kind of relates it to others as well. And he basically says, look, I don't think it's proper to turn everything into, he says, I think he says it here, that I don't think it's proper to turn everything into prudence. And I think it's here where he says that I don't think sympathy should be thought of as a matter of self-interest, sharing of sentiment, the pleasure of shared sentiment, and so on. So he I think rejects prudence here. On the other hand, I want you to realize that when he talks about the wise and virtuous man, the wise and virtuous man would feel terrible about misaligning with the good of the whole. And so that feeling terrible is an interest, and it becomes kind of internalized as a self-interest. So if you expand the notion of interest that a self has, and hence its self-interest, and you go up to this superior prudence, there is a sense in which virtue for the wise and virtuous man consists in prudence. He doesn't say that, but it seems to me that you could kind of shoehorn prudence in as fitting Smith's virtue for the wise and virtuous man. Now, none of us are the wise and virtuous man, so in that sense, it doesn't really fit for any of us. But still, there's an approach to a fit as wisdom and virtue move upwards, I suppose. So, and then the next one is benevolence, and this is like a benevolence to the whole of humankind. Essentially, it would need to be, and he associates this especially with Hutcheson, and Smith rejects this and says, benevolence may be the sole principle of the deity, but we're mere human beings. We have a feeble spark of benevolence, a lively feeling of benevolence only. And so he rejects this. It's impractical. It's not possible. It lends itself. I don't know if he says this here, but he does say it earlier, to a kind of faux benevolence. But again, remember that benevolence does play a super important role in Smith's system, because it is about aligning to God joy, who is universally benevolent. So again, it relates to Smith's system very importantly, but it wouldn't be, human benevolence wouldn't be the synonym by any means of virtue. Okay, then he's got a last chapter on, what does virtue consist in? What's a synonym, as it were, of virtue? And this one is not actually about a suggested synonym. It's about Mandeville, who, as Smith represents him, you can't ever put total trust in how Smith represents people. I think he tends to kind of construct foils and attach people's name to them, sometimes not accurately. And so I really can't say how fair this is to Mandeville, given all the irony and, the difficulty of kind of how to read Mandeville. But anyway, what he's saying is that Mandeville, in a sense, denies a distinction between virtue and vice. That basically he kind of pushes aside the very idea of virtue. And Smith frowns on that, to be sure. And so it's quite critical of Mandeville. On the other hand, he says somehow Mandeville was hitting upon some important truth. What's funny is that Smith doesn't really make clear what that important truth is. But anyway, so that's about what virtue consists in. Then the second question, and that is the principle, as he calls it, the principle of approbation. What principle gets us to recognition and embrace of virtue? How do we know virtue? What draws us to virtue? And I got to say, in something about just this little opener first, he's got this remark here where he says, this question, though of the greatest importance in speculation, is of none in practice. I find this an extremely odd statement. It's one of the oddest statements in the book. I suspect that in some way he doesn't really mean it, and he's dissembling. I just don't see in the kind of Hume-Smith, view of things that something can be of great importance in speculation, but none in practice. That goes very contrary to other things that are often said in Smith and in Hume and in Burke. And it just doesn't really work for me. So, I wonder what's going on here. But that said, so he then gets into different things as this, faculty or principle of approbation, and he does self-love, and here he rejects this, and this might be where he says, I don't consider sympathy cannot, however, in any sense be regarded as a selfish principle. So, this kind of relates to what I was saying before about prudence on the other question. And, if you let everything be a selfish principle, if you let everything be a self-interest, then it becomes kind of meaningless because you're not even drawing a distinction. It's kind of the spirit of this here. But on the other hand, like I say, we do get attached to our routines and our affections, which is, what's affection? It's habitual sympathy. So again, self-love does, for the wise and virtuous man, would actually drive towards virtue. Okay, so again, it kind of has a backdoor way into Smith's principles, if you will. And then he talks about reason as the principle of approbation. And he says that's not sufficient. And this would get you into questions of, the meaning of the word reason. I think in Hume, reason turns out to be clearly polysemous. Eric Madsen has talked about R1 and R2 reason, and R2 becomes very expansive and open-ended and imaginative, interpretive. But basically he rejects reason, and then he says sentiment as the principle of approbation. And he explicitly indicates here at the end that this is where to see his theory. Okay. Yeah, so I just hope that this helps, because these get rather abstruse. And this looming question is, okay, how does Smith's thing, where does Smith's fit in to the array that he's presenting? And it's clear that he indicates that sentiment is his principle of approbation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not that his system isn't also connected to reason, depending on how you interpret it, as well as self-love. Again, as you're talking about the more wise and virtuous man. And in terms of what virtue consists in, the first question, he indicates, propriety as important, and he kind of embraces what Plato says about that and what Aristotle says about that. But that's not to say that that covers everything in Smith. So he wouldn't reduce it necessarily to propriety. Again, you might think about how commutative justice isn't really about that main idea of propriety that Smith talks about from the beginning of the book. So, okay, well, I hope this is helpful. Bye-bye.